Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Hydragons Breath. Bow wow. Welcoming you back to another Archon's Adversaries. The funeral pyre of Enothis. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our Enothis wrap-up. So, moving on to a quick recap. I know it's been a while since I made a full Adversaries for you. It's good to be back. Now, we are on the planet of Enothis, and going on with several things that have occurred as far as our votes go, and as far as our recap goes. I will make this quick so that we can get through this wrap-up in a decent amount of time, because we have a good amount to cover. A series of close and tactical losses and retreats on Enothis have left several things, unfortunately, in the hands of our Chaos invaders. The Blood Pact and several fellow Magisters have devoted significant forces to taking over this planet within the Cabal group. Now, current Imperial forces are bottled up within the remaining bastion of the Trinity Hives. These are a trio of large and relatively well-fortified hive cities in the southern portion of Enothis' habitable zone. These forces include about 30,000 Imperial Enforcers, the equivalent of PDF police troops on Enothis, chapter serfs of the 3 different Space Marine chapters that have been involved in this conflict, the White Scars, the Iron Snakes, and the Silvern Guard, along with several groups of militia that have basically been organized in response to this chaos uprising. Now, the Enforcers, that original force that we've been talking about with the planet's PDF, is still remarkably poorly armed. However, with many Marines and several of their ships now trapped on this planet by Chaos Embarkment and by the blockade of the planet's orbital space, they have been granted slightly more firepower. Now, it's not a significant difference than their standard fare, still more autoguns and things of the like, but they are at least going to be equipped in larger part with rifles as opposed to their standard ammunition of pistols. The chapter serfs and the militia are a completely different story. The chapter serfs are usually equipped with some form of laser or bolt weapon. Now, sometimes it's just a las pistol, sometimes it is a more high-quality shotgun, but oftentimes chapter serfs will be equipped with some form of laslock or even a lower grade of lasgun. The militia, again, are completely different. These are the local dispossessed. They are the individuals who have risen up of their own accord, armed themselves of their own accord, and pitched into the defense as much as they possibly can. This includes family members of Enforcers, many of them bereaved by the invasion of other hives on Enothis, and there's quite a bit of vengeance and vinegar in these forces to continue the fight. In addition to those, the Imperial forces are mostly buoyed up by a little bit over a company of Astartes who still remain to hold out against the Chaos forces. They were the original defenders of Enothis, and they have chosen to stay behind rather than attempt to flee with the rest of their forces. Possibly because the Chaos forces have cut off their escape route, but also because they have a moral duty to protect these people who are the Emperor's subjects. Facing up against them is a massive force of Chaos followers. 150,000 mixed cultists, elite Chaos troops, Traitor Guard equivalents, and several other groups, including the Astartes warband, the Dark Tusks, who number in the upper 30s, even at the remaining moment, so a significant force, along with orbital and significant aircraft support. One of those interesting situations where Chaos actually has both void superiority and massive air superiority over the battle space. However, this is going to be our last video. This is the last gasp of the Defenders. We're going to see how it shakes out. The entire invasion of Enothis, this massive military campaign, has been a sprint. 8 full days of constant combat. Not one day has gone by that a major battle has not occurred, as is relatively common for this massive of a battle space where elite forces are being thrown around at a constant clip in order to deal with multiple spots of resistance. But it is the 8th day, the next day of the next week, and a specific battle that we touched on last video is going to reach its head. The Silver Guard, a majority of their chapter, or rather their company, along with the Iron Snakes, their commanders, have decided to sally out, trying to eliminate all three of the enemy Chaos Magisters in one single battle that is going to be referred to as the Battle of the Burning Beaches. So, let us get right to it. Battle of the Black Sand, as the Chaos Forces call it, but the Battle of the Burned Beaches, as the Imperials will refer to it. Now, we went over last time how this battle had been going basically in the Imperium's favor. A majority of the defenders were in the city of St. Hagen to the south, while the Black Sand occurs on the northern coast, where the great battleship of the Incarnadine had crushed the coast with orbital fire in order to cut them off from the central hive of Enothopolis. Now, why attack northward instead of towards where the main enemy force is located? Because the Imperials have very, very good intelligence that the Chaos Forces are attempting to start a foothold on that side of the hive as well. The Trinity hives are well defended. They have artillery support, they have great walls, and they have various redundant defensive forces that will allow the defenders to hold out for a long period of time. If the Chaos Forces can start off with 2 penetration points into those defenses, or at least have a much wider and more powerful command structure that they can use to try and coordinate attacks, it will make the Trinity hives that much less secure. And, knowing that, the Imperial Space Marine forces have gone after the 3 leaders, who they have decently solid intelligence, are going to be setting up this new command section. Now, the forces involved on this side of the fight, and specifically on this little back end of the fight, where our captains are actually going to find the quarries that they seek, are as follows. There are several large dunes around the primary command bunker that has been hastily thrown up for the command station of our Magisters. Specifically, we have, from the Gutta Thraka, a group of High Thorns. Now, the High Thorns are specifically Rushek Vakim's personal bodyguards. The High Thorns are usually equipped in much, much heavier void armor, very similar to the bulky type that you would see from the early 30th millennium. It is very, very heavy stuff. It is all-encompassing of their bodies, and they are also equipped universally with warp flamers. The purplish flames that you see on the map are from them. The High Thorns are personal bodyguards of Vakim, as you'll see is very common with this group, and the High Thorns are absolutely of the loyalty level required to fight to the death even against Astartes. Next, from the Vahedwalk, the only personal defender of the Vahedwalk's leader, Nokad the Blighted / Nokad the Smiling, is referred to colloquially as Flesh. Flesh is a disgusting and arguably very disturbing creature. He is a Strixus flesh monstrosity. A monstrous, vat-grown brute, one of the ones that we talked about in our video on our last Adversaries series with Shale 17. Now, Flesh is a relatively old construct. He's been around for quite a bit of time, and he has also been refitted several times. Specifically, Flesh is about 8.5 feet tall, weighs upward of 400 pounds, and has a significant armored carapace built into his bodywork, in addition to several hooked and arguably, Witch King mace-sized melee weapons grafted onto the end of his superpowered arms. Finally, representing the Blood Pact at this defensive position, you have a small group of Death Brigadiers. They are on the exterior, and then within the area, but not currently involved in this defense, is a group of 10 of the Kimura. Now, the Kimura are an arguably illegal deployment. Technically, Enoch Inokenti is not legally allowed to bring the Kimura away from the Sanguinary Worlds because they are considered the most important asset for the Pact, some of the most deadly soldiers that they have access to, but in this situation, they are going to come in very clutch. Not right at the moment, but we will see. So, apart from the Chaos Forces, the Imperials have brought several of their own. Each of the commanders have brought a second and a set of squad mates to come with them in attempting to break open this fortress in the dunes. Now, storming the bunker, once the counteroffensive reaches its zenith, for the Iron Snakes you have Brother Captain Phaeus of the 9th Company of the Iron Snakes. He is equipped, as we mentioned before in the first video, with Lightning Claw and Power Sword, a very, very classic combination. Now, Phaeus has had kind of an interesting, or rather an unfortunate hand in this invasion or in this conflict so far. Phaeus initially very much wanted to take the fight to the enemy. He was out on the very first day cutting off the cultist forces of the Headwalk trying to get from Enothopolis to the Trinity Hives. He was at the Battle of the Isthmus and he performed his task admirably. However, he has been deeply held back in this conflict, wanting to send himself out on a whole bunch of different missions to try and support his chapter brothers. He has been repeatedly remanded by the actual leader of the quote-unquote defenses of Enothis, and that is the Silver Guard's 10th Company captain, Alentis. Now, Alentis is equipped, as with many Silver Guard elites, with an Eviscerator chainsword and bolt pistol. However, why is he in charge of the overall conflict, and why haven't we talked about him so far? Alentis is the one in charge of the overall defense because he is technically the most numerous marine force on Enothis at the moment. Therefore, and following along with many of the standard tendencies of his chapter, he has put himself as the center of resistance, and has repeatedly called back or hauled back on offensive movements in an attempt to hold out for the longest period of time. While he's been doing this, Brother Captain Phaeus has been effectively convincing him, or trying to convince him constantly for almost the entire week, to send out a major counteroffensive. The Battle of the Black Sand is technically the first time that Phaeus has been successful in his request for Alentis to actually go out and do something. Now, Alentis is by no means a coward. He is much more of a realist. He understands that trying to meet this entire Chaos Force in open combat, when they will have orbital and aircraft superiority over the Imperial forces, is just going to waste men, and hopefully he hopes to hold out longer than they would hold out if they were simply going to get gunned down by orbital fire. So, not entirely a terrible strategy, but he's been worn down to the point where he now has to make a decision, and his decision, of course, is to attack. Now, each of them has brought a second with them, as I mentioned. For the Iron Snakes, we have Brother Librarian Ameno. Ameno is a fairly standard Brother Librarian. He's using a force sword and bolt gun. Now, Ameno generally is not a close combat specialist. He definitely prefers the bolt gun to the force sword. However, he is very much a blaster caster, and he's going to make great use of that firepower throughout these combats. He is a powerful Brother Librarian, and he has quite a few Traitor Witches and Psychers under his belt in terms of kill notches. The ability to accompany Brother Captain Phaeus is basically two-parter. One, Ameno is just as willing to get into the fight as Phaeus, however, he's not the head librarian of the company, or of the chapter, rather. He is definitely more of a logistical and protective individual, even if he would certainly prefer to be out on the battlefield obliterating stuff with his magics. So, there's Ameno. We will see about him in a minute. Then we have our final member of this quadrangle of important Space Marines, Veteran Vengeancer, Jesus. Okay, that is a canonical, rating, essentially, for the Silver Guards. It's called a Vengeancer. It is what they how they refer to their veterans. Kind of the same way you have, like, Vitrix Guard, a little bit. At least that's my understanding of how the Silver Guards treat their Vengeancer. The Vengeancer in Ingtar. Now, Ingtar is also a little bit of an odd one. He is older than anyone else in this group, including every single other Marine they have brought with them. He is not from the 10th Company. Far from it. In fact, Ingtar is actually a 1st Company veteran. Now, why is a 1st Company veteran serving with the 10th Company? It's part punishment and part retirement. Ingtar was once one of the top of the top of the top of the first company. Technically, both allowed to wear Terminator armor and also very commonly serving along with the Chapter Master in several different engagements around the Imperium. He has seen many, many battlefields. However, Ingtar has a couple of important flaws. One, for all of his vengeance or nature and all of his veteran status and his undeniable skill, he has a certain level of hot-headedness. Even more so than Feus, who definitely wants to get into the fight, Ingtar is ridiculously aggressive, to the point where he has been sent to the Death Watch more than once, and returned more than once alive. So, Ingtar has basically resisted every single opportunity from the Chapter Master to chill the fuck out, and as a result, he has now been seconded to a more conservative commander who doesn't have to deal with the fact that Ingtar will constantly put himself in active engagement range with enemies that he has no business trying to kill. Another great reason why he was so successful in the Death Watch is because he would commonly engage with as large of a Xenos creature as he possibly could, and then attempt to take it down effectively by himself. Shockingly, he has not died yet, nor has he suffered any severe wounds that could not be fixed by the Apothecarian. However, he has suffered several minor wounds over the years, and his face is an absolute mess. It has been broken and fixed multiple times. Now, not only is the Marine wielding the weapon quite interesting, the weapon that he is wielding itself is rather unique. Now, for the Loyalist Astartes, the Devourer is not an odd weapon. It is certainly a beautiful and quite impressive relic, no question. It is a massive two-handed, arguably three-handed, if you really wanted to be splitting hairs, Eviscerator chainsword. So again, very much like Alentis, they are both using Eviscerators. And the Vengeancer generally has either an Eviscerator or something of the equivalent, a Paragon sword or something of that nature. The really interesting thing about the Devourer, which the Imperials don't actually know, is its origins. Now, the Devourer is a Blood Wolf relic. And it may seem odd. Is that some sort of Space Wolf? Well, technically, but it's not the type of Space Wolf that the Space Wolves like to tell you about. The Devourer was taken from one of the last battlefields that the Blood Wolves were involved in, and ended up getting sent down to the 10th Company Reliquary, and has now been broken back out again as the Silver Guard's primary strike cruiser has been grounded on Enothis for the moment. The Devourer is outwardly no different from any other number of Space Wolf relics. It is large, it is fanciful, it has, the standard arrangement of skulls and teeth and wolf marks and hanging beads and all that fancy stuff, and the yellow and blue and gray markings that are fairly standard. The difference is who was basically last using it. The Blood Wolves are one of the only Space Wolf groups to effectively turn full traitor at any point. And while they weren't necessarily so heavily corrupted that their weapons started to get damaged, the Devourer was technically in the hands of Chaos forces for a significant period of time, only picked up for its relative importance to the Space Wolves as a chapter. It was removed first by the Inquisition for testing, and then once deemed relatively safe, was given over to the Silver Guards, and then of course, as mentioned, seconded to the 10th Company for no use. It was not intended to become a primary weapon of anyone. It was not really intended to become a weapon that anyone even used outside of an emergency situation. Problem: the Battle of the Black Sand is absolutely an emergency situation, and so the Devourer is broken out, and it is given to Ingtar. Now, why would Alentis not use the weapon himself? Probably because, as a company captain, he has no intention whatsoever of putting a weapon that he's not comfortable with in his hands. And the difference between the Devourer and a standard Eviscerator is actually pretty big. And I say that quite facetiously because the Devourer is pretty big. It is essentially just a half a foot longer in terms of handle and blade than a standard eviscerator. So it is bigger, it is heavier, and it prevents, or it would prevent, the company commander Alentis from using his bolt pistol basically in his offhand while using the eviscerator. So the Devourer has fallen to Ingtar. We may see something occur with that during this combat, but let's talk about the combat itself for just one moment here, because it is a short, brutal, and violent one. So, the Marines have pushed out with whatever limited forces they have, whatever aircraft, whatever rhinos, etc., to make the long journey about 10 or 15 kilometers northward from the city of Trinity Hives out to this command post. Now again, they had good intelligence that the defenders would likely be the ones defending the Magisters, you know, their personal bodyguards and things like that. It does not take long before the presence of both blood-packed Death Brigadiers and the Guttathraka's High Thorns make it very fucking clear that the intelligence was correct. But they only realize shortly later of just how problematic their defenders are going to be. As they mount the very last dune in large groups, 2 whole squads, you know, a total of around 6 of the Iron Snakes, and 7 of the Silver Guards. Sorry, I had to count real quick there. So 7 Silver Guards and 6 Iron Snakes, including our 4 champions. As they mount the dunes, one thing makes itself quite obvious. The purple, blue, and red flames of some of the High Thorns in this frontal trenchway here become a serious problem. These are not standard flamers. They are essentially heavy flamers that are shooting out massive gouts of warp fire. In the early morning when this fight takes place, there's this prosaic spray of light as these Zechian warp flames eat up the territory between each squad of Marines and start chopping up the battlefield as this blue, yellow, and gold pinkish fire literally catches the ground alight and starts to burn through the sand, leaving even more black volcanic ash behind it. So, if there was anything to confirm that this is definitely the area where our biggest enemy is going to be, it would certainly be that. However, not stopping at just showing off just how much firepower the defenses has, they also send out the biggest asset they have: Flesh. Now, Flesh was basically in a bolt hole. He's not a very intelligent creature. He essentially just responds to basic commands. Go here, kill stuff, shut up, sit down, go in that corner, do basic things. Not very intelligent, not really controlled in the same way that the Strixus are able to. So, Flesh's primary directive, until he saw enemies, was to sit inside of the far left bunker and wait for further instructions. Now, these bunkers are not incredibly durable. They're essentially a mix colloquial of sand, pycrete, and other types of shall we say, frangible or relatively fragile defensive materials. They can certainly tank bullets, but they are not really designed for bolt rounds, nor are they really designed for what this specific bunker is about to be subject to. Now, Flesh see enemy. Flesh knows that those enemies are certainly worthy of his giant metallic claw arms. And so, of course, Flesh begins to stir. Here's the real problem. If Flesh were just the product of Strixus witchery and evil, he would be undetectable to Brother Librarian Ameno, and he likely would have gotten a good charge off on Ameno. The problem is that Flesh has been with Nokad the Blighted for a very long time, well over 2 decades in real space, acting as the Magister's bodyguard. This has given him 2 things that make him visible to the Brother Librarian. One, he's lost a lot of his subtlety and training. Rather than crawling out of or prepping a run-back charge out of the bunker, he smashes through the roof, cracking through it like a Godzilla movie, and breaking his way out of his confinement in order to get at his enemies. So the subtlety of any silent charge through the early morning dawn is completely gone. What's also problematic is that Ameno can literally smell him. This creature is filled, suffused even, with the power of the warp. What is biological about the creature has begun to develop several different strains of mutation, some of which are just downright disgusting and not worth discussing, others of which have made it, shall we say, quite potent in the olfactory area. So, as Ameno is walking along, anchoring that side of the line, the far left there, he's able to detect this creature, and then, of course, watches it blast out of its bunker hole and begin to run towards him. Ameno calmly lowers his bolter, aims at about waist height to this flesh beast, which can basically look down on him from its piggish face up in the air, and empties the entire magazine into its legs. Flesh is armored, not so heavily, however, that he can simply overcome that much damage. He makes it about 30 yards until he is almost 15 feet from Ameno before the bolt rounds finally break both of the joints in his legs, and he's forced to continue crawling towards him. Even with that crippling done, Ameno is not necessarily done with this creature. It is still crawling towards him, its massive clawed fingers whacking into the sand, ripping itself forward and making disgusting honking and squirting noises as it does so and as it slowly bleeds out. So Ameno goes the extra mile and strikes it with a smite. A bright yellowish flash of lightning shoots out of the center of the marine's chest and blows this riven creature into shattered remnants. Now, Ameno is probably the most successful amongst all of his brothers. Ingtar and several of the other silver guards are stopped by individual bunkers. Again, these bunkers are not entirely invulnerable to bolt rounds, but inside of them are Death Brigadiers with all manner of weapons. These are not the standard Death Brigadiers. These are not the individuals who would just have hell guns and maybe some heavy bolters. These are the personal bodyguards of our Magisters. That means that they are equipped almost universally with hell guns and chain swords. In addition to that, within this squad there are several individuals who have plasma guns. Most of those guys have ended up in a bunker rather than in the trench line, which is relatively quickly taken, even given the fact that the High Thorns are in that trench line as well and are attempting to hold it with fire. Now, Warp Flame is quite effective even against Marines. It can melt ceramite armor, it can damage and cripple Marines rather quickly. And it does so. One of the Marines is quickly brought down by a gout or two of Warp Fire as the two High Thorns in that area concentrate fire in order to knock him out. However, it is so few of them and so many of the Marines that they're very quickly overtaken. Ingtar himself has to charge one of the bunkers in order to bash it open with his shoulder and rip the Devourer about waist height to himself, lopping two of the Pact Sons inside into several different quivering pieces as their blood sprays across the dust and sand. Now again, this is a mix of black volcanic sand and standard, but in the pre-dawn light, that glistening blood sure does make Ingtar feel, almost like he can see his reflection in that beautiful stuff. However, it doesn't take long before the outer forces are finished, and what's left of the Marines who aren't going to be going inside focus upon the inner defenses. These are more heavily filled with the High Thorns. With Flesh taken care of and the Blood Pact's Death Brigadiers mostly scattered or killed, the High Thorns are the ones left to fight to the death. Several of their other Death Brigadier brothers among them, they stay within the trench line and the bunker until they are completely destroyed. Phaeus and Alentis both march ahead of their brothers, throwing grenades and, of course, encouraging others to do the same until the entire trench line is cleared out, leaving only the bunker for them to deal with. Now, the four of our captains here, Phaeus of the 9th, Alentis of the 10th, their veteran Vengeancer Ingtar, and Brother Librarian Ameno, have several ways of breaking into something like a central command bunker. However, they choose the most ostentatious option, a large and relatively bulky physical kinetic charge. Now, there's two reasons for this. One, melta charges can be of different use elsewhere, and this physical kinetic charge is essentially 50 pounds of plastic explosive hooked up to an unfortunate servitor detonator. Now, The command bunker is relatively tough, relatively thick. It is not a patchwork construction like the rest of the defenses around this area, and so that detonative force is definitely required as they breach. And the storm immediately goes into absolute overdrive. Checking on our forces so far, the bunker door shatters, exploding instantaneously, and our 4 move in. Captain Phaeus, Librarian Ameno, Captain Alentis, and the Vengeancer Ingtar. Most of them are completely without wounds. Ingtar is the only one who has taken some damage, and that has essentially been finished with a bayonet basically shoved underneath his arm from one of the Bloodpact troops who managed to avoid the Devourer's swing. Now, that aside, they basically come into instantaneous combat with the reception crew within the bunker. The Magisters have not been idle, and they are well aware that they are under attack. However, the massive explosion of the doors has kind of messed up what their initial plan was. The goal of having both Nokad and Vakeem instantaneously attack these foes basically has to be scuttled, leaving Vakeem the only one who can go into direct combat immediately, as Nokad backs up, trying to clear his eyes from the, shards of metal shoved into his face and skin that just got blown out of the door. How then does our beloved Lightning Lord enter this combat? As one might expect from a Reaver of Men, with lightning and fire. Now, as opposed to the Warp Flamers used by his High-Thorn bodyguards, Vakeem has a much different setup. On each wrist, he has a pair of lightning claws, 2-finger lightning claws, or rather, 2-bladed lightning claws coming out of the back of his wrists, and then in addition to that, on each arm he has a Warp Flamer. Dropping down from the side of the door, he immediately shoots both of these weapons directly at Librarian Ameno. Now, unfortunately for him, he kind of picked the worst possible option in terms of trying to use a warp weapon against a Marine. Ameno immediately shoots up a massive shield of defensive energy, pushing this purplish-green warp fire towards basically anything but himself. This spray does split up the group a little bit, but Vakeem watches in absolute horror as the Marine simply takes a step forward through his lightning and flames and walks toward the Magister as if he weren't currently getting broasted in warp fire. So, as Vakeem backs off in the absolute and utter horror, the battle truly breaks out. Vakeem is immediately hit by something else. Ingtar has gone to the left of our group, and as Vakeem takes his first step backwards, he receives a brutal strike from the Vengeancer. Essentially what should have been a very, very solid swing, where the Vengeancer was holding up the Devourer, intending to swing it at full strength, gets knocked out of position as this psychic duel, or rather the psychic defenses of Ameno, spray a bunch of warp fire right past what should have been his target. Even with that, the Vengeancer still finishes his swing, this almost baseball bat-like swing, and whips it through the warp fire and catches Vakeem at the very end of the swing. Essentially, as the blades are finally pulling up, and the Vengeancer Ingtar thinks he's kind of missed his target, the very end of this oversized Eviscerator chainsword still clips Vakeem in the chest and throws him about 3.5 feet backwards, smashing him into the corner of the bunker wall. This immediately shatters the Magister's back. Even with the heavy carapace armor that he's wearing, it cracks off one of the heavy antlers on his helmet, it rips his shoulder pad completely off, it breaks his breastplate, and the smack against the wall cracks several vertebrae in his back. Now, Ingtar may have taken out one foe, and from the sickening crack that Vakeem gave off when he smacked into the wall, he definitely thinks that that guy's not getting up anytime soon. However, he sees a much more important target, and, more importantly, he sees Captain Alentis going directly towards it. Now, Alentis is again the commander here. So, what is his primary goal? Find the enemy commander. And he sees 2 enemies in that forward area of the bunker that he wants to get rid of immediately. Enoch Inokenti is staring down the company commander with absolute anti-captain death in his eyes. The massive, heavily armored individual is guarded by his life ward, Atrodai. Now, we're going to get to Atrodai in a minute, but first, let's finish off with Ingtar. Ingtar, seeing his company captain, is going after this specific target, knowing that it's definitely his job to go after him, rather than running directly towards Vakeem and finishing him off, or even choosing to intercept Nokad, who's running past him, sprints directly towards Enoch, intending to knock him out, and of course, to protect his captain. So, with those two heading after Enoch and Atrodai, what are Phaeus and his brother librarian Ameno doing? Well, they're dealing with some rattling chains. Nokad the Blighted has many unique and arguably disturbing things wrong with him. From his intractable schizophrenia, his multiple personality disorder, his very much overwrought feral worlder physique, and some would argue a primitive mind, not necessarily unintelligent, just cunning and brutal, very much in the same way that an orc would be considered cunning and brutal. He has received some gifts that allow him to be quite a danger, and one of those are his primary weapons. Two massive axes. As one would expect for a feral world creature, this would not normally be too much of a danger to a marine, and Ameno certainly thinks so. So, of course, seeing Nokad immediately after clearing his eyes of the explosive debris, sprinting at the librarian at full speed, he does, of course, exactly what he did to the other stupid creature that he saw earlier today. Blasts Nokad in the chest with a huge bolt of warp lightning, only to watch a very similar shield to the one that he just activated burst up around the Blighted Magister and deflect the lightning bolt, just as his defenses had deflected Vakeem's warp fire. Now, this is not of Nokad's doing. Rather, this is a gift from the Archon, from Nadzybar. His primary weapons have been enhanced, and more specifically, given an anti-psyker trait. Very similar to a collar of corn, especially in its activation, this chain that ties together Nokad's two axes protects him from psychic powers. And, what's even better, that lightning bolt didn't even slow him down. So, Brother Captain Phaeus, countercharging the Magister, and of course expecting that lightning bolt would at least put a damper on the bastard, is shocked to find that there are several very fast, very dangerous, monomolecular bladed axes the size of meat cleavers being swung directly at his head. However, it is Captain versus Magister here, not to mention that we also have a Brother Ameno who's very happy after dropping that warp lightning and overcoming the shock of having it simply do nothing, drops the front of his bolt gun and starts emptying that towards the Magister as well. While Nokad is resistant to many things, direct hits from bolt rounds would certainly not be in his wheelhouse. So, rather than duel with Phaeus and allow the Marine Captain to maneuver him in a way where the Brother Librarian can simply put him down with a bolt shell, Nokad chooses the slightly more intelligent option. He fights, keeping Phaeus's back to his Brother Librarian. As Phaeus pushes him, he's pushing him further and further backwards into this corner until eventually Nokad is standing right above Vakeem's body. Now, at this point, one is defending the other. Nokad's duel with Captain Phaeus is not an even one. Nokad is struck repeatedly, both with Power Sword and with Lightning Claw. The difference here, as opposed to any enemy that Phaeus may have currently fought against as a relatively young captain overall, is that Nokad is basically tanking it. Every single nick or swipe or strike that isn't caught by the chains or smashed aside by the axe heads of this unnaturally powerful and unnaturally swift creature doesn't doesn't seem to bother Nokad whatsoever. What's even more disgusting and disturbing, even the power sword hits that don't come directly in contact with vital organs seem to be healing or regenerating at an unnatural rate. What is also infinitely worse is that every single hit or block with these axes against the power sword, they are also slowly cracking themselves back into place. Now, that's not to say that the axes, after a couple of passes, don't look like a set of jig-jagged teeth, completely shattered and snapped in some areas, but they are still one piece of metal, whereas every single other weapon that Feus has ever fought against would definitely have been in two pieces if it wasn't a power weapon at this point. Completely shattered, however, they are much less capable of damaging Feus overall, and as Nokad swings forward for another massive haymaker, once again wrapping one arm with the chains in order to try and keep Feus's other offensive option, the power claws, away from his face and neck, Feus is done with this stupid dueling shit, and so he just takes the axe swing directly to the side of his helmet. The jagged blades of the heavy iron weapon, no longer perfectly monomolecular as they've been literally hacked into pieces by his short power sword, crack and break against the ceramite steel. They do, however, give Feus one hell of a whack, as even with a lot of their blade destroyed, they're still quite heavy pieces of steel, and they snap his head sideways. This likely saves Nokad from being cut in half at the middle. Even with that, the power sword slices through him almost to the level of his ribs, the blade coming about 3 inches deep into his central abdomen and gutting him on the floor. Even with that, however, Nokad refuses to lay the fuck down. Rather, he puts his back to the wall, puts both axes out in front of him, and sits, or rather wall sits, above Vakim's body, allowing his guts to spill all over the ground as the rest of the fight transpires. Now, that is just one half of this actual battle, and all of that took basically less than 2 minutes in terms of time. What's happening in the meantime? Well, it's a series of unfortunate events on the other side. We certainly have some heroic last stands and some dangerous attempts to survive deadly peril with Vakim and Nokad, but Enoch and Atrodai are arguably more deadly than the two of them. Atrodai is a very strange creature, especially for Ingtar and for Captain Alentis. They've never seen what looks like a beast man this quick, long-limbed, willowy and thin, and yet unbelievably strong. They've been told and briefed about things like the Kimura before. They don't necessarily all know all of their powers, but they do know that they are unnaturally strong and fast. Atrodai is not technically a Kimura. He is what's referred to as a life ward within the Blood Pact. Again, the Imperials don't know this, but this is a creature essentially raised and then trained from birth as a bodyguard. And as such, he is completely and utterly bonded to Enoch Inakenti. Atrodai is also remarkably well armed, on top of being fast and strong. He's nowhere near the Marines in terms of strength, but he is definitely unnaturally strong, and he is definitely a one-to-one with the Marines in terms of speed. And, given that fact, his choice of weapon is particularly problematic. He has 2 long, Kopesh-like blades. They're curved, they're blue-black at the edges, and they're giving off an unnatural light. This is because they are both ensorcelled weapons. They essentially act as lower-grade power weapons, resisting the Eviscerator blade strikes, while also having the ability to lop, chop, and hack at the Marine's armor, essentially trying to crack through or break through some of the protective pavis. So, Atrodai is managing to hold his own at least against Ingtar. With Brother Alentis in the mix, Enoch has to actually put in some grunt work. Now, what is Enoch toting around? Outside of any ranged weapons he might have, which, of course, Alentis does first try and open the fight by shooting Enoch to death with his bolt pistol, Unfortunately, it doesn't work because one of the major things that Enoch has that the other Magisters don't lack, but they're just not currently using, is a refractor field. Now, his refractor field is built into his armor, much like Vakim's would be if he had been shot by anything, other than just getting clipped in the chest by a giant eviscerator chainsword. But the refractor field is able to stop any bolt shells until Enoch can actually get into close combat with Alentis. Now, the back and forth between Alentis and Enoch versus Ingtar and Atrodai is a very different type of fighting. Enoch's primary weapon, his most deadly weapon, is the Corruptor Blade. The Corruptor Blade is a large, cavalry saber-looking power sword. Now, it is, of course, a chaos weapon, and truly a chaos weapon. This is a demonic blade now, but the Corruptor Sword is very, very different from most other demonic weapons. Rather than giving off chaotic energy or consuming chaotic corruption, rather than giving off chaotic corruption or giving chaotic corruption to the person that is using it, it does the exact opposite. It absorbs chaos corruption, it eats it in a way, and it uses that to physically boost the abilities of the wielder. It is essentially like a power converter. He eats chaos corruption, or the Corruptor Sword eats chaos corruption, and it feeds strength and feedback into its wielder. In this way, the more Enoch fights with the Corruptor Blade, the more powerful he gets. However, with a weapon that powerful, there are downsides. Especially with the physical strength of Enoch outside of combat, he has taken a turn for the worse. As you can tell from the artwork, he is rather, shall we say, sick. So, the fight between him and Alentis is completely different than the fight between Ingtar and Atrodai. Enoch, fighting with the Corruptor Blade, is much more the hack and slash fighter, and it matches Alentis' fighting style to a T, with the only difference being that Alentis has superior reach and significantly superior armor protection. Each swing of the blade, each massive scything blow from the Eviscerator, doesn't necessarily get pushed aside or dodged so much as it gets literally hammered down, a two-handed strike from the Corruptor Sword coming to block and smash down on the housing of the Eviscerator and really start to test the durability of Alentis' primary weapon. Where he's forced to actually defend himself and truly try and avoid the Eviscerator's strikes, Enoch is basically forced to do a hanging block where the Corruptor Sword is used in both hands and then smacked down into his body by the weight of the Eviscerator. More than once, Alentis will then turn the side of the Eviscerator towards Enoch and try and rip back and downwards as if he was trying to rake him with the claws and blades on the front of the Eviscerator, but it is only partially effective because of the heavy layered steel armor that Enoch is wearing. So it's this elemental hack and slash, batter and smack weapon fighting between these two. Again, Enoch's basically entirely relying upon the power of the Corruptor Sword, whereas Alentis is without some sort of overmatch power that he can use to try and stop this unnatural force as it drinks in more and more corruption, increasing Enoch's speed over time. Atrodai and Ingtar are having a completely different type of duel. Atrodai is a much more accomplished fighter, especially in close combat when compared to Enoch. And in addition to that, he is using two weapons as opposed to the single one. However, Ingtar is much more heavily armed, arguably, than even his captain. The Devourer is swinging at high speed, with enough speed that more than once Atrodai is forced to literally ride the blade, hooking both of his Kopeshes onto the moving chains and throwing himself backwards over the blade as if he were doing a gymnastics move. This is essentially the tenor of their fight. It's not beautiful, it's not graceful, it's harsh and violent from the side of Ingtar, using this massive chainsword as if it were a club or a cudgel, trying to truly get a clean strike on this unnatural, elongated beastman, while Atrodai quickly and swiftly moves out of the way or hooks his blades beneath, around, and redirects the weapon, using his quick follow-up opportunity to hack and smack at Ingtar's body. Fortunately, while Atrodai is quite strong and, more importantly, very, very fast, Ingtar is definitely the more veteran of the two in terms of years, and it only takes a very short period of time to get the, shall we say, vibe of his opponent. And once that vibe is down, the Vengeancer has absolutely no interest in continuing this dance anymore. His captain is starting to struggle with the enemy Magister as Enoch becomes more and more of a violent threat holding this corridor, and he wants to end it now. Ingtar, very quickly, with as much speed as he possibly can, reaches forward and grabs Atrodai by the throat, completely ignoring the two blades that come down and clench around his elbow joint. As Atrodai, assuming that this Marine is completely suicidal, lops off the Marine's arm by crossing both of his swords in a guillotine strike. Ingtar completely ignores it and brings down a massive sledgehammer blow from the Devourer. The huge chainsword hooks right onto the Life Ward's shoulder and rips downward. Atrodai barely saves his own life, but he loses half of his torso, basically. It rips off all of the armor on one side of his body, grinds through his clavicle and 3 ribs before completely ripping his arm from his body and lopping off a quarter of his musculature down, off, and onto the ground. Yellowy and electric blue blood sprays from the Life Ward's wounds as he drops to his knees, expecting to be executed. However, something is different about that strike with the Devourer. The Devourer is a chaos weapon. Now, it's been dormant for a very long time, and it's had some lock and preventions on it put there by the Blood Wolves to prevent anyone from finding out its true nature, and no one at the point of the Inquisition nor of the Space Marines had any interest in trying to remove chaotic energy or add chaotic energy to this thing. They had simply observed it and tested it and seen what was wrong with it and observed that perhaps nothing was wrong with it. However, for the first time in its existence, it's been exposed to something that, rather than giving it more chaotic energy, removed chaotic energy. The Corruptor Sword, only a few feet away, starts to ruin and remove those wards that the Blood Wolves had placed upon the weapon to make it look normal. As Ingtar makes that massive downward stroke that almost completely eviscerates Atrodai from existence, the blade changes. The huge weapon grows not only in weight, but also in savagery. The natural Blood Wolf icons and symbols completely disappear, as the blade's appearance rapidly changes to that of a matte black and red blade. Imagine, if you will, the Dragon Slayer from Berserk. This thing is huge. It is literally taller than Ingtar, and as the weapon smashes into the ground, completely against his will, the trigger continues to pull itself, grinding into the concrete and spitting up rocks and dust into its operator, who was definitely not expecting his weapon to suddenly go apeshit. The weapon completely loses all of any of his control and begins to rip around on the ground, trying desperately to find flesh to consume. Now, that's the first unfortunate event. The other one is Captain Alentis. Alentis is a talented fighter. He is a Space Marine captain, not by any level of simple assumption. He's there for a very good reason. He is absolutely able to defeat Enoch Inokenti, the backwoods dipshit magister who just happens to be here at this time. Even the Corruptor Sword only slightly evens out the fight between him. And as the two of them get into it and truly get into the last section of their fight, where Alentis is truly preparing to end this creature's life with a single swipe, Enoch turns and runs. sprints down the hallway at the absolute maximum speed. After all this focused dueling, all of this skilled capability, showing off all of this to the Marine, Alentis swings, and Enoch turns his back and runs. Just sprints down the hallway, and Alentis is after him immediately. One single stride, and he's within swinging range for the execution stroke, for the Eviscerator to part this coward Magister's back and end his life. The Life Ward is no longer there to defend him. Ingtar is dealing with his own bullshit. It's all down to Alentis. And he swings back, ready to make this massive strike, and something hits him in the face. Initially, he thinks it might be a grenade or something swinging at him, or maybe even a melee attack or some cowardly throw like pocket sand from Enoch. He's wrong. It's heavy, it's thick, it's durable, and it is disturbingly clinging to him. As he reaches his hand up to try and grab whatever's obscuring his vision and move it away from his helmet, something else hits him in the leg. And then another, and another, and another. As each of these forms hook their way onto Alentis, they begin to bite at him and claw at him and hook into the edges of his armor with clawed, hooking claws, and many times they begin to pierce through his protection. Swinging the Eviscerator wildly does almost nothing. He could have sworn he lopped off limbs, hacked through a couple of bodies, and yet there seemed to be more clawing and ripping at him. It's only when one of them manages to tear his helmet free of its seals that he can see what's basically eating him alive. Kimura, 10 of them, have split their attacks between him and Ingtar, thrown themselves over the Magister and the Life Ward in an attempt to bring them down. So focused upon his attack at the front, he had not seen the creatures coming towards him from the back of the bunker. As Enoch had made his apparent escape, they had been leaping over him in an attempt to blind and now to tear apart the Brother Captain and the Vengeancer. By the time that he realizes what horror is upon him, the set of wolfish claws have already closed around his skull, and after a few seconds, that skull is no longer attached to the Brother Captain's body. The Vengeancer has a much less dignified end. His aggressive tendencies and his need to finish off this creature now and go help his Brother Captain, who he can see is now at odds with these violent and oddly possessed-looking creatures, is unfortunately waylaid by the fact that his sword is simply no longer obeying him. Its chaotic nature and its extreme violence don't seem to vibe with his touch. Every time he grabs the sword blade, every time he tries to hook his fingers around the trigger, it once again guns and revs and rips and pulls itself away from him, heavily pulling into the floor until the point where he simply abandons the weapon and runs towards the Kimura with his combat blade out. Without a pistol, he's forced to take them on in close combat, and he simply has no chance. With Alentis being taken down by 5 or 6 of the Kimura, an unarmed Marine, essentially, only takes 3. The last one pulls Enoch off the ground and charges back into the fray. The 4 immortals who had come into this bunker had certainly been expecting something. Every single turn in this combat was effectively a left from what they had been expecting. This is one of the first times that Marines have come into direct combat with multiple Chaos Magisters of the Zhou Sanguinary at the same time. This is multiple relics that they had not known existed, did not expect, and many unfortunate circumstances that, while preventing them from doing their job, have accumulated to the point of not allowing them to leave. Only 2 of the 4 Marines who entered the bunker are able to escape, as Chaos reinforcements, not to mention the Kimura, clear out the remainder of the bunker. Brother Captain Feus and Captain Ameno see the forms crushing and killing their fellows, and flee. Now, it's not for no reason. They're not simply terrified of the Kimura to the point where they have to flee. Nokad the Blighted is missing half of his intestines sloughing out over the ground, not to mention having multiple cuts and wounds so deep that his natural regeneration is preventing them from healing. Vakeem is completely immobile, his upper body flailing about as his broken spine only allows him to shoot out gusts and bursts of warp fire at the enemy, and both Marines would likely assume, and would probably rightly assume, that at least some of these Magisters are going to die. In addition, Atrodai is absolutely going to die in their minds, as they do not know exactly what he is. So, they have every reason to believe that their job has been done, and there is no reason for 2 company captains to die today. And so they move on. The Magisters are able to pull off most of their wounds. There is going to be some permanent damage, and of course, that chainsword is going to have to be looked at, but we can talk about that later, as that is some extended lore, especially to Urlach Gower. So, hoping that at least one of the Magisters, if not 2 or more, are going to die, the captains retreat with all forces under their hands in order to consider their current situation. Had they not retreated at that moment, they also would have likely seen fit to deal with the significant Chaos reinforcement and the huge amount of air power that was being brought against them after the previous fights that we had talked about, draining it from the rest of the Chaos forces. Those aircraft were returning exactly to this location in order to deal with this sudden incursion. Now, there is some problems with the current position of the Imperials, and I agree with the overall vote that the channel had in order to assume that the Imperials would escape, while perhaps having a bit of an opportunity at some sting in the tail or something else similar to that. This has been the sting, now we have to get to the escape. The problem is that there are not many ways off of Enothis for either the Imperial citizens or even the Marines themselves. So, they do the best that they can. They get every single ship that they can get to float, including, temporarily, the Silver Guard's strike cruiser, which they can only hop out of the hive and then use as artillery and as a distraction, while the other ships desperately attempt to break orbit and barely do so in order to warp jump out of the area. Now, everything not on those ships is now effectively trapped on Enothis, including the downed Iron Snake strike cruiser, the human defenders, 3 of the White Scars, the only survivors of their company, who choose to stay behind, nobly and honorably sacrificing themselves to defend some of the more heavily wounded Marines, and the mortal defenders of Enothis, and in order to give the refugees who leave on the ships some opportunity to not be slaughtered. For all of this nobility, for the chance that the White Scars and the wounded and the other mortals took, hoping that they'd be able to survive, as the rest of the Marines leave, it only takes another day before Trinity Hive falls entirely to Chaos forces. With the Marines gone, the better half of about 80 of them, there's no chance to hold the hives. And they're very simply overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The only ones who manage to hold are the White Scars, and they are finally defeated, leaving the entirety of Enothis in chaotic hands. The Imperial escape is fraught with much sacrifice and danger, but also with the absolute nobility of the 8th Company of the White Scars. Completely wiped out to a man. Not one choosing to flee, even when they had the opportunity to do so. Truly, the Sons of the Khan honor all of Chagoras' nobility. As a result of the success of the Enothis campaign, what had been a significant gamble in the Cabal system, no question, a reinforcement fleet, led by the Archon himself, Archon Nadzybar, arrives in system. This has 2 opportunities. One, the combined fleet is finally big enough to attempt to challenge the fortress world of Vandamar, which is the entranceway into the Cabal sector. That coordinated, it also gives the rest of the Magisters, especially those injured like Nokad and Vakeem, an opportunity to book it out of this subsector. They have suffered far too much and lost far too much to try and deal with the rest of Enoch Inokenti's fuck-up. Enoch is left to clean up his goddamn mess on Enothis, pending what is very likely going to be dangerous chastisement for his actions. He can only hope that the death of a company captain, several veterans, a whole bunch of dead marines, and that important relic that he managed to secure from Ingtar's corpse, the Devourer, soon to be referred to as the Gaur's Guillotine, Urlach Gaur's primary weapon being what used to be the Devourer, a Blood Wolf relic. He certainly hopes that those will be enough to save his neck from the Archon's ringing fists. So, as we close off Gates of Fire, let's do our regular Adversaries Wall of Heroes. We've had a lot of losses this time, and interestingly enough, all of the important deaths for this one have come at the hands of the Kimura. Again, that was not intentional. That is just how it ended up happening. Brother Captain Vorga Khan of the 8th Company White Scars, Brother Captain Alentus of the 10th Company of the Silver Guards, Veteran Vengeancer Ingtar were all slain by Kimura, either directly or indirectly. In terms of Vorga Khan, he was killed by the current leader and head Fel Damagour of the Kimura, that being the, well, probably pretty well-known Mabon Etagaur of Sabbat Worlds Crusade fame. So, in addition to that, we of course have the old deaths from the Eresus campaign, a close Tau victory, the Lugnum campaign, a close Imperial victory, and the Nightmare of Shale 17, which one could argue was nobody's victory. One could also argue that it was a Pyrrhic Chaos victory, as the demons who now inhabit, arguably, the station are indeed having a good time, and they are the only ones who are doing so. Now, I put all these up here, and I mentioned this is likely going to be the last Wall of Heroes for a specific reason. As we transfer over a lot of the adversary stuff, and we change the format a little bit. Of course, I'm going to do Indiga, and I'm going to finish that one off, and it's going to be fun. I have a lot of things planned for it. It's going to be a little bit fancier, perhaps a little bit more narrative-based. I did intend to do more narrative like I did with this one, not just reading off the slides, but also just going into it and trying to explain the differences and the personality behind these people, which we'll get in further. I really, really want to include either some of these dead folks or some of the survivors in our future adversaries campaigns. If there was one character, one person, or a couple of people that you were like, man, I really want to see them again, or man, I really didn't get into that force all that closely, man, I really would like to see what they were like, I really wish they didn't die, I highly recommend, because we're going to have a vote on where they're going to end up in future and in subsequent adversaries. I want to hear your guys' opinion, your thoughts, any votes you may have on who you want to see again, or what force you want to survive. I mean, we have the Frozen Fly, who all escaped as a full cult. We have Sister Nestia, who escaped severely wounded. We had Lieutenant Hearn of the Joe Paul as a castaway on Shale 17, definitely its own story in and of itself. We have Grim Shevech. We have Veteran Sergeant Arret, we have several tech priests, we have a whole bunch of individuals like Shas Vumpaton of the Tau. We also have Dosima Respec from Forge Anwari, and, you know, we have a whole bunch of other individuals. Ansal Yo, a couple of individuals who have survived this one. Again, this was an off-canon campaign, so we may or may not come back to these guys. But for all of that, I would like to know if anybody wants to see these guys again. Particularly, I want to use the Frozen Fly again. I think that it'd be a really, really fun cult to run through some stuff with other adversaries campaigns. But that's just an idea. So, as usual, credit goes to GW, Clint Langley, Miguel Iglesias, Archer Nadokin, Dima Sokolov, Dmitry Ustinov, Reese Poe, Dave Kendall, TD Weiss. So, more videos coming up. Of course, Indiga is going to be, again, in this similar vein. I'm going to try and do more narrative stuff as people have requested, but I'm not yet to the point where I can have a structure on one computer and then recording on the other. Unfortunately, I'm just not to that point yet, technically. And we might have campaign changes in the future to accommodate that, but we'll see how these go over first. There's also going to be a new alternatives vote. I'm going to put that up once this video is done and finished. And of course, tomorrow, this Friday, we have D&D, which I will say,
I love that people have been enjoying that. It's been so much fun to do that with my group of friends. It's good to collaborate on YouTube now and again, so, you know, people are coming in and not just hearing me all the time. And I hope that my D&D experience and my DMing chops have not been too boring for you guys. In either and any way, of course, as usual, I wish you all such a good day, and I wish you all a lovely good night.